This video was adapted from my 2021 essay, Transgender People, Bathrooms, and Sexual Predators, What the Data Say. A link to the original piece can be found in the show notes below. It is my most thorough response to this common anti-trans talking point. If you appreciate it, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting my work on Patreon. Content note: while I will not be describing any actual instances of sexual violence or child sexual abuse, these issues, and false accusations thereof, will be discussed throughout this piece. For more on why such false accusations against trans people and other marginalized groups are so pervasive, please check out my 2022 book, Sexed Up: How Society Sexualizes Us and How We Can Fight Back. I have been involved in transgender communities since 1994. And those communities had already existed for decades before I appeared on the scene, as any trans-themed history book can tell you. And we've been using public restrooms during that whole time without causing any harm to others. But then suddenly, in 2015, 1 year after Time magazine famously proclaimed the transgender tipping point, a slew of so-called bathroom bills were proposed in US state legislatures. These bills, in one way or another, set out to prohibit trans people from safely using public restrooms, under the presumption that we must pose some kind of a threat to women and children in those spaces. Such claims continue to persist, with multiple states having passed such legislation and a federal trans bathroom ban recently proposed. In this video essay, I will make 3 general points in the following sections. First, I will delve into the actual data that demonstrates that trans people do not pose a threat to anyone in public restrooms, nor are trans-inclusive restroom policies exploited by sexual predators. Second, I will review historical data chronicling how this bathroom predator myth has its origins in religious right claims from the 1970s and 1980s that centered on how homosexuals were supposedly child molesters and pedophiles who were out to recruit children. It was only during the 2000s, just as said claims were losing their effectiveness against gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, that religious right organizations shifted their efforts toward targeting trans people instead. Third, I will highlight additional ways in which anti-trans campaigners have taken to falsely smearing trans people as predators who are out to groom and sexualize children. I hope that this piece not only provides a readily citable source for debunking bathroom bills and related anti-trans propaganda, but that it also raises awareness about how the sexual predator trope is a more general tactic that is repeatedly used to stigmatize and stereotype marginalized groups. Part 1. Trans people are victims, rather than perpetrators, of harassment and assault in public restrooms. Whenever people raise anti-transgender bathroom concerns, I typically point them to the following 3 articles. Mazza and Brinker, 15 Experts Debunk Right-Wing Transgender Bathroom Myth, published in Media Matters for America in 2014. The byline for this piece reads, experts in 12 states, including law enforcement officials, government employees, and advocates for victims of sexual assault, have debunked the right-wing myth that sexual predators will exploit transgender non-discrimination laws to sneak into women's restrooms, calling the myth baseless and beyond specious. Barnett, Nesbitt, and Sorientino. The Transgender Bathroom Debate at the Intersection of Politics, Law, Ethics, and Science. Published in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law in 2018. This is a peer-reviewed study that states in its conclusion section, quote, from a scientific and evidence-based perspective, there is no current evidence that granting transgender individuals access to gender-corresponding restrooms results in an increase in sexual offenses, end quote. For additional summary and context, see this Think Progress article about the study. Hasenbusch, Flores, and Herman. Gender Identity Non-Discrimination Laws in Public Accommodations. A review of evidence regarding safety and privacy in public restrooms, locker rooms, and changing rooms. Published in the journal Sexuality Research and Social Policy in 2019. This peer-reviewed study used Massachusetts as a case study, quote, to empirically assess whether reports of safety or privacy violations in public restrooms, locker rooms, and dressing rooms change in frequency in localities that have gender identity inclusive public accommodations, non-discrimination ordinances, as compared to matched localities without them, end quote. They report that, by using public records and statistical modeling, we found no evidence that privacy and safety in public restrooms change as a result of the passage of such ordinances, end quote. For additional summary and context, see this Teen Vogue article about the study. While there is no empirical evidence to indicate that transgender people pose any kind of a threat to cisgender people in public bathrooms, the reverse is not true. That is to say, transgender people are routinely harassed and even assaulted by cis people in such settings. Here are a few studies that address this phenomenon. Jody Herman, Gendered Restrooms and Minority Stress, the Public Regulation of Gender and Its Impact on Transgender People's Lives, published in Journal of Public Management and Social Policy in 2013. From the abstract. This paper employs a minority stress framework to discuss findings from an original survey of transgender and gender nonconforming people in Washington, D.C. about their experiences in gendered public restrooms. 70% of survey respondents reported being denied access, verbally harassed, or physically assaulted in public restrooms. These experiences impacted respondents' education, employment, health, and participation in public life. End quote. James et al., the report of the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, published by the National Center for Transgender Equality in 2016. This was a large survey of 27,715 transgender people across the United States. The main bullet points from their experiences in restroom section, pages 224 to 230, reads, nearly 1/4, 24%, of respondents said that someone had questioned or challenged their presence in a restroom in the past year. Nearly 1 in 10, 9%, respondents reported that someone denied them access to a restroom in the past year. 1 in 8, 12%, respondents were verbally harassed, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted when accessing or using a restroom in the past year. More than half, 59%, avoided using a public restroom in that past year because they were afraid of having problems. Nearly 1/3, 32%, limited the amount they ate or drank to avoid using the restroom in the past year. 8% reported having a urinary tract infection, kidney infection, or another kidney-related problem in the past year as a result of avoiding restrooms. Murchison et al., School Restroom and Locker Room Restrictions and Sexual Assault Risk Among Transgender Youth, published in the journal Pediatrics in 2019. From the discussion section, quote, in our sample of transgender and non-binary U.S. adolescents, the 12-month prevalence of sexual assault was 25.9%, substantially higher than the national rates of 15% among cisgender high school girls and 4% among cisgender boys. After adjusting for potential confounders, compared with non-restricted youth of the same gender identity and sex assigned at birth, school restroom and locker room restrictions were associated with 1.26 times the risk of sexual assault for transgender boys, 1.42 times the risk for non-binary youth AFAB, and 2.49 times the risk for transgender girls. End quote. Of course, this rampant harassment and assault of trans people in public bathrooms inevitably results in some gender nonconforming cisgender people facing similar abuses under the mistaken presumption that they are transgender. Here are but a few articles chronicling such instances in which butch women have faced heightened scrutiny and harassment in women's restrooms as a result of the current anti-trans panic. At this juncture, it's worth pointing out that the logic behind bathroom bans is twofold. The first presumption is that trans women are really biological men. I debunked that simplistic notion in my video Trans People and Biological Sex, What the Science Says. The second presumption is that men are inherently dangerous, while women are inherently safe, and therefore, the presence of trans women would disrupt the supposed safety of these women-only settings. However, this presumed safety is proved false by all the cisgender women who are harassing and assaulting trans and butch women in public bathrooms. Since there is no empirical evidence that trans women, or transgender people more generally, represent a threat to women or children in sex-segregated spaces, anti-trans propagandists have largely taken to citing anecdotal cases of real or imagined sexual misconduct that seemingly involve a transgender individual, and extrapolating from that we all must be inherently dangerous. But of course, I could do the very same with the significant numbers of cisgender women who commit acts of sexual harassment, coercion, and assault, as summarized in the study Stempel, Flores, and Meyer, Sexual Victimization Perpetrated by Women. Federal Data Reveal Surprising Prevalence, published in the journal Aggression and Violent Behavior in 2017. The authors of the study also summarize this research in this Scientific American article. It is indisputable that some cisgender women commit acts of sexual violence, but it would be unfathomable to claim that all cisgender women should be banned from public restrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, etc. simply because of the actions of a relative few. I'm sure there's near unanimity on this point. To apply a different standard to trans women, despite the lack of valid empirical evidence indicating otherwise, is pure bigotry. No more, no less. Part 2. Placing transgender bathroom panics in historical contexts. Trans people are most certainly not the first marginalized group to ever be demonized as potential predators. In the article, Why Are Right-Wing Conspiracies So Obsessed with Pedophilia?, Ali Breland revisits several moral panics from over the last half-century, all of which raise similar concerns about protecting children from some imagined insidious threat. The gist of the article is captured in its byline. The story is the same, from the daycare panics to QAnon. It's not really about the kids, it's about fears of a changing social order. In The Anti-Trans Bathroom Nightmare Has Its Roots in Racial Segregation, Gillian Frank points out how fears of sexual predation were routinely invoked by segregationists during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, who, quote, claimed racial integration would grant black men sexual access to white women, and white women also emphasized that contact with black women in bathrooms would infect them with venereal diseases, end quote. Frank goes on to discuss how these racist stereotypes were later invoked by opponents to the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, in the 1970s. Quote, anti-ERA activists asserted that among the ERA's consequences would be mixed-gender bathrooms. Here, anti-ERA activists applied widely shared racial codes to the Equal Rights Amendment, particularly in their idea that the sex integration of bathrooms would lead to black sexual violence against white women and children. End quote. Warren J. Blumenfeld's article, How LGBTQ People and Jews Were Stereotyped as Violent Predators, highlights the history of how the straight white Christian majority has, quote, long accused both Jews and LGBTQ people of acting as dangerous predators concentrated on ensnaring, torturing, and devouring primarily women and children of the dominant group. End quote. Both the Frank and Blumenfeld articles also mention the most recent and direct predecessor to today's trans bathroom panics, Anita Bryant's 1977 Save Our Children campaign. The premise was simple. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual, or LGB, people had been making progress in getting non-discrimination ordinances passed in an increasing number of jurisdictions. Bryant and other social conservatives effectively thwarted that progress by claiming or insinuating that LGB people posed a specific threat to children. If you've ever heard claims that LGB people are pedophiles or child molesters who are out to recruit children, all these ideas were popularized by Bryant and other social conservatives during that time period. While most people nowadays understand these claims to be false and harmful stereotypes, they did a lot of damage back in the day, both in undermining LGB rights and exacerbating anti-LGB hate crimes. In a recent study entitled Frame Variation in Child Protectionist Claims, Constructions of Gay Men and Transgender Women as Strangers, sociologist Amy Stone examined religious right campaigns spanning the years of 1974 through 2013, analyzing them for their shifting themes regarding potential threats to children. Campaigns from the 1970s through 1990s focused primarily on imagined gay male sexual predators who were supposedly becoming teachers to seduce young children, or else, quote, infiltrating organizations like the Boy Scouts and Big Brothers to establish child pornography and prostitution rackets, end quote. But by the 2000s, there was a precipitous shift in these child protectionist campaigns, away from the specter of gay teachers and towards trans women. The latter were inevitably portrayed as men in dresses who posed a danger to women and girls in the bathroom and locker rooms. Here is a graph from Stone's paper, which illustrates this dramatic shift in messaging. So remember, the next time you come across anti-trans themed bathroom panics, what you are actually witnessing is merely a rehashed version of the homosexuals are child molesters campaigns of the past. Part 3. Who is sexualizing whom? Once bigots stereotype a marginalized group as sexual predators, then it becomes relatively easy for them to wield language intended to describe actual sexual violence against members of that group, even in scenarios where sex or sexuality never even come into play. One flagrant example of this can be found in the blog post Pronouns Are Rehypnol, which has been widely cited and celebrated in UK gender-critical circles. Rehypnol is better known by its street name, roofies, that is, the infamous date rape drug. The blog post argues that merely using a trans person's pronouns, quote, slows you down, confuses you, makes you less reactive, they dull your defenses, they change your inhibitions, they remove our instinctive safety responses, end quote. The implication that acknowledging a trans person's pronouns is tantamount to, or enables, sexual violence is cemented in the closing passage. Quote, I owe this to girls. I don't want to play even the tiniest part in grooming them to disregard their natural protective instincts. Those instincts are there for a reason, to keep them safe. End quote. The word grooming refers to when an adult befriends a child and builds up their trust over time in order to make it easier to eventually sexually exploit or abuse them. But in the hands of vehement bigots, grooming can be hurled at trans people for virtually anything we do, such as displaying a pride flag or teaching adult college students about trans and queer studies. As an aside, when I penned my original essay back in June of 2021, this grooming charge was still somewhat limited to hardcore anti-LGBTQ activists. The earliest instances that I found at the time, and which I linked to in the piece, were in 2018 and 19 in the US in response to drag queen story hour events, where drag queens simply read children's books to a group of children in public libraries. I also linked to Katie Montgomery and Krista Peterson's YouTube video, Gender Critical is Painting LGBT People as Pedophiles, which chronicles the rise of UK gender-critical activists equating gender-affirming care with grooming circa 2020 and 2021. Of course, by the spring of 2022, this grooming charge went mainstream here in the US, as the Republican Party veered head-on into anti-LGBTQ legislation and demagoguery. All of these news stories are from a roughly 1-month period around April of that year. Accusations of grooming are closely linked to another common allegation, namely that transgender people are sexualizing young children. Outside of anti-trans propaganda, the term sexualization is typically used to refer to when a person is reduced to their real or imagined sexual body or behaviors to the exclusion of other characteristics. So in other words, if, rather than see me as a complex person with lots of traits, some transphobe reduces me to the stereotype of a transgender sexual predator, they are in fact sexualizing me. Or, if social conservatives and other anti-trans activists adultify trans children in an attempt to portray them as potential sexual threats to other students, then they are sexualizing those trans children. For more on this, see Amy Stone's article, Gender Panics About Transgender Children in Religious Right Discourse. I also discuss this adultification and sexualization of trans children in my book, Sexed Up. One way in which people can be sexualized is if they are reduced to the status of a sexual object to be used by others. This is clearly the connotation that anti-trans campaigners are attempting to evoke when they assert that trans people are sexualizing children. But even a cursory glance at the content of these claims reveals that this is not at all what is actually going on. Take, for instance, the Family Policy Alliance article, New Jersey Senate passes bill that would sexualize kindergarten. Holy cow, you'd think they were legalizing child sexual abuse in schools given that title. But according to the more mainstream NJ.com, the bill in question would simply, quote, update the New Jersey student learning standards to promote economic diversity, equity, inclusion, tolerance, and belonging in connection with gender and sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, disabilities, and religious tolerance, end quote. In other words, diversity and inclusion are tantamount to sexualizing children in the minds of anti-LGBTQ propagandists. Of the many examples of such claims that I came across in my research, perhaps the quintessential one was the Heritage Foundation's article, We Must Fight the Sexualization of Children by Adults. It begins with more general fears about child pornography, sexual abuse, and sex trafficking. But then it abruptly turns to drag queen story hours, sex education that includes transgender theory, the Equality Act, which would amend the Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity, trans-inclusive bathroom policies, and gender-affirming medical treatment. It's as if anything and everything associated with transgender and LGBTQ people constitutes sexualization of children in their eyes. So in my original 2021 essay that I adapted for this video, I ended with a then recently proposed Texas State Senate Bill number 1646, which, according to this article, quote, defines parents of trans kids consenting to healthcare as child abusers and places Texas parents consenting to gender-affirming care for their trans kids alongside those who create child porn, sexually abuse children, give illegal drugs to children, and those who facilitate forced child marriages. End quote. While that bill did not ultimately pass, in February 2022, Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued a directive to this effect. But as soon as Texas began investigating families, the policy was challenged in the courts and ultimately blocked in March 2024 by a Texas state appeals court. More recently, in the infamous Project 2025, which has been described as a blueprint for the incoming Trump administration, transgender ideology, by which they mean anything that acknowledges or accepts trans people and perspectives, is conflated with both pornography and the sexualization of children. On this basis, they argue that all of it, including presumably this video and me, should be outlawed and imprisoned. While it's unclear at this point whether Project 2025's Trans People Equal Pornography or Texas's Affirming Trans Children Equals Child Abuse positions will ever become codified into law, they both represent frightening examples of how far these sexualizing children arguments can be taken. So, in conclusion, I hope this video has helped you, and the people you share it with, see through these transgender sexual predator tropes, which have no basis in reality and serve the sole purpose of preventing trans people from participating in society. For further reading on all this, my latest book, Sexed Up, examines how we perceive and interpret, and sometimes misinterpret, sex and sexuality. Why we tend to view women and other marginalized groups as excessively sexual or marked by sex in certain ways, and why being reduced to the status of a sexual being tends to have a delegitimizing or degrading effect on people. You can learn more about the book in this chapter-by-chapter preview. Some of the themes in the book, especially our tendency to associate sex with stigma and imagine fears of contagion, are further explored in the online essay Anti-Trans Grooming and Social Contagion Claims Explained. Both of these pieces are linked to in the show notes. And as always, please remember to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting my work on Patreon.